paperback and e-readers this March. John Haynes, the man with nothing to lose. The man who rules the world runs into the irresistible force of a man with nothing to lose in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get the regular and variant cover editions of John Haynes, the man with nothing to lose this March. In a recent Bleeding Cool article, legendary comic book artist Rob Liefeld said that most of today's comics are endless talkfest and are just cackling heads. And after reading many of today's modern comics, I have to agree with Rob Liefeld, because when I take a look at many of today's modern comics, they are just filled with dialogue and they have next to no action. Now, the main reason why we are having the problem of comics today being endless talkfest is because many people who write comic books have no real training in the craft of comic book writing. Now, comic book writers oftentimes, because there is no course on learning how to write comics, think that they can apply approaches that they have learned from the mediums of the novel, the screenplay, and the stage play to the comic book, not understanding that the medium of the comic book is completely different than a stage play, a screenplay, or a novel. Because when you are writing a comic book, you have to understand that this is a visual medium, but it's a visual medium of static images. And those static images have to be dynamic enough that they move the reader's eyes from one panel to the next in the strip of comics, and that strip has to be so compelling that it gets readers turning the page until they finish the completed comic book. But most writers today, because they don't know how to pace a comic book, what they do is they get caught up in the dialogue that they're writing, not understanding that no one wants to sit there and read through a series of panels of talking heads. Now, this is something I learned about when I was reading Sid Field's screenplay about talking heads. And a talking head scene is one where you just have two characters just sitting there talking for a good long sequence. But what happens in that sequence is it becomes very tedious for the audience, because all they're doing is seeing two or three characters just sitting there talking for a long time. And that's, if you're buying a comic book, it can be even more frustrating, because the problem is you have to turn page after page to see the same two characters sitting there talking. And when you have a talking head scene, you have action that is going nowhere. And when you have talking head scenes in comic books, that means that that publisher is not going to get many sales, because no one is going to pay money to read 32 to 48 pages of this talking heads where they're just going back and forth, because it's a comic that practically goes nowhere. Now, the comic book medium is known for action, and action is images of people doing things. And this is a big problem with today's writers, is they don't know how to write action sequences of people doing their thing, which is characters, and they don't understand that characters are defined by their actions. For example, a superhero is defined by the powers that they have, and the reason why people are paying money to read a superhero comic is to see that superhero kick butt. And as they are kicking butt, we want to see them using their powers in creative ways, whether it is to overcome a bad guy or to get themselves out of a jam that they have gotten themselves into taking on a bad guy. So that's what people want to see from a superhero comic, and that's what makes the audience care about a superhero comic. And this is the big problem with a lot of today's comic book writers, is a lot of them are so caught up in writing this dialogue and having these characters go into these back and forths and putting all of this exposition in their stories, that their stories practically go nowhere once the penciler and the inkers and other people who do the visual part try to put that story on the page. And the main reason, again, why so many comic book writers are doing this is because many of them are poorly trained. They don't really have the skills for writing comics, and some arrogantly believe that they can apply approaches to comic book writing that they took from other mediums. For example, with your Tom King, who recently did a run of Batman comics, he came in and trying to use poetry approaches and trying to craft a novel in his Batman run. Unfortunately, that led to a Batman run of comics that was practically slow to read and was a struggle for the reader to understand, because many of the sequences he put in his stories practically were repeating themselves over and over again, panel after panel. And when you have panels of sequences of the same dialogue over and over again and the same things going on over and over again, it slows down the reader. And when you slow down a reader in a comic and don't get them to get to the last page, what happens is you're going to lose a sale. Then there are some comic book writers out there who want to take the screenplay approach, and what they want to do is turn a comic book into a movie. And what they don't understand is a comic book is not a movie, and when you try to use screenplay approaches like trying to make action sequences in a comic like a movie, they wind up going too slow as well, because in a screenplay you have a camera shooting the action, and that action you put in a screenplay can move a lot quicker on screen. But in a comic you have static images, and if the action is not dynamic enough in those static images, what happens is the people wind up losing sight of what you're trying to do, or the action winds up getting slowed down to the point where it practically goes nowhere. So these approaches, the novel and the screenplay, they only work within those mediums, but the comic book medium, you have to understand that every image has to move. You have to be making images that draw the reader's eyes from one panel to the next panel, and we have to be following that character as that action is going along, and that action needs to make us care about what's going on, because expository sequences, they are good for maybe a page or maybe two at the best, but you have to have some sort of action going on in those panels as you are explaining things in order for that reader's eyes to keep moving. The big problem with today's comic writers is they want to have these expository sequences, and these sequences are practically going on for 5, 10, 15 pages in some cases, of people sitting around eating, and I don't want to pay $5 to see somebody sitting in a room and talking back and forth with someone, and because that whole sequence, again, is practically 25-30% of the book, and it's all talking heads. And people don't understand that a talking head sequence, it's not what people are paying money to see. People are paying money to see something happen in these comics. They want to see, if they're reading a superhero comic, a superhero going out to fight the bad guy. They want to see the obstacles that the hero is going to face, the conflict that they have to deal with, and they want to see these characters finding a way to overcome those obstacles in the pages of that comic that person is holding. Because if you don't put the action in the comic, then people don't have a reason to buy the comic, because no one wants to sit there and watch an endless comic that just keeps on talking. And I've seen this in books like your Magnificent Ms. Marvel, your Captain Marvel, and many other comics. And it's really irritating when you're sitting there and all they're doing is talking in a room for 5 to 10 pages of a comic, and it's not going anywhere. And that's all due to a writer not sitting down and doing things like I do. When I write a story these days, I look at it and I say, I have to read it over. And I read it over and I read it aloud sometimes to see if the action is going in the right direction and to see if the dialogue is flowing in a way that moves the story forward. Now, a lot of these writers today, they aren't doing that. And because they aren't doing that, what's happening is their stories are practically going nowhere, because a dialogue sequence should be no longer than maybe 1 or 2 lines in a panel, and there should not be big paragraphs, because that means you are literally slowing the story down. I mean, it should be 1, maybe 2 panels of it, and then we get right back to the action. We need to see characters doing their thing, because in a comic book, we need to see those images moving. We need to see those images moving this character around so that people have the incentive to turn the page. But too many of today's writers, they don't understand this. They think that having some characters just standing there and talking is a comic, but that's not a comic. That's just bad writing, and bad writers oftentimes make their comics endless talk fests, because all they know how to do is write these expository sequences of dialogue. And expository sequences of dialogue, again, they are good in small sequences if it's going to move the story forward, but if it's not, you need to cut it almost immediately. I mean, a good tight story only has maybe only has a little bit of dialogue and only enough to move the story forward. I mean, I've seen comics with practically a chunk of text, and that's not a comic book. A comic book is, 1 or 2 balloons here or there, but we are seeing the action going on, and the action is the thing that people are coming to a comic book for. Because again, a comic book is a visual medium, and again, these are static images that have to be dynamic enough to move. And an image of a guy sitting on a sofa drinking coffee and talking to another guy, that's not really enough there to compel a reader to buy a comic, especially if it's a superhero comic. To sit there and you have to sit through 15 pages of this, it gets really annoying, because you want to see that hero in action, and you want to see that hero taking on whatever obstacle they have to take on, whatever bad guy they have to take on, and you want to see that hero using their powers, and you want to see this action going on. This is what the reader and the audience is paying for, but in many cases, we don't get that presented to us, because a lot of writers, they focus on all of this exposition, because some of them, again, want to write a Hollywood screenplay, others want to write the great American novel, and others want to write stage plays, but those approaches do not work in the medium of comics. And you have to understand that the medium of comics is completely different than a stage play, a screenplay, or a novel. And if you want to just write a novel, go write that novel, go write that screenplay, or go write that stage play, and leave the comic book medium to those who want to craft quality comics and want to make the medium have stories in it that are compelling for the audience. Because that's the big problem with a lot of today's writers, in addition to the poor training, is a lot of them have stars in their eyes and they believe that their writing style is so great, but it's not great for the audience when they have to sit through a comic where the action is practically going nowhere. It's just really frustrating when you spend $5 on a comic and there's nothing that happens in that book and then you have to go out here and then shell out another $5 for another comic where all we get are all of these talking heads, people drinking coffee, people having sodas, people hanging out. I mean, that back in the days of Teen Titans with Marv Wolfman and George Perez, yes, he would do sequences like that, and Chris Claremont would do it with the X-Men, but it would be a panel or two, but then we would get right back to the action, and this is not happening in today's comics because of these poorly trained writers and editors who give them a pass instead of holding them accountable and letting them know what the rules of the comic book medium are. And those rules, again, are these need to be static images that need to be dynamic enough that they move people's eyes from one panel to the next, and they need to feature a main character, the conflict that they're dealing with, the obstacles that they have to face in the terms of the villain or the problem that they're dealing with, and a reason to make us care. And you need to do this in the first 3 to 5 pages of the comic. And if you don't do it in the first 3 to 5 pages of the comic, you're going to lose the reader. It's just as simple as that. And sadly, there are no editors to sit down and tell these comic book writers that if you lose the reader within the first 3 to 5 pages, you have lost the sale. Because the reader needs to see this action going on, and each page of talking heads slows down the action, and it takes the reader out of the book and prevents them from caring about what's going on. So you have to do this within the first 3 to 5 pages. You have to give us that main character on the splash, doing whatever they're doing, show us what they want to do in this issue on the second page, and the conflict that they're facing, and the obstacles they have to face in trying to overcome it, and the reason why they need to go into action, which is why should we care? And you need to make us care within that 3 to 5 pages, because that's the thing that gets the sale on that comic book. And this is something, again, that is not being taught to aspiring comic book writers, and it's something that needs to be taught, because this is how you stop the talking head syndrome, or these sequences that practically go nowhere in a comic book. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. There you can find all of my books in paperback and Kindle formats on Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.